Thank you, and good morning. Thank you for inviting me. And it is very clear, we have heard that already. We live in really troubling times. I mean, really, really challenging times. But at the same time, we have people like you, people who are change makers, people who take responsibility. And that is also unprecedented. I've followed Teach for All since its humble beginning, and I see this never growing. Every day there are more countries taking the same route. Every day there are more people joining forces, and that makes me optimistic that despite everything that we see, we can actually advance this. Often we get distracted. Lots of things trouble us every morning when we wake up, and we see what else can there be. But the biggest force that is silently working in the background is technology. One of the greatest supporters for education, providing amazing possibilities for us in Europe and elsewhere, but also putting many things that we do in education to the test. The kind of things that are easy to teach these days, they have become easy to digitize. They disappear from our societies, our labor markets. The decline in educational outcomes that we see in many places has a lot to do with technology as well. We see decreases in reading in a country like Austria. Ask yourself, how differently did you read 10 years ago, 15 years ago? You probably read a lot more complex texts. You probably engaged with a lot more divergent viewpoints in a long book and so on, and that has all been gone. We read snippets of information and often just stuff that confirms our own beliefs and ideas. So I think technology, big part of the solution, big part of the problem. And when we look, at the progress in the OECD and Europe, is a good representation of this. We've seen, sliding outcomes. In that sense, Andreas, I'm not so sure how our times will be remembered for. Now, if we look at results, probably, have not changed the needle very much. But again, we do see change in some parts of the world. When you look outside Europe, that's where most of the change and improvement actually happens. You can see Singapore, moving from good to great every day. We can see countries, parts of China, Japan, moving forward. And then there comes Estonia. But it's probably, at least on the metrics, that it's the only country in Europe that is on a positive trajectory and at a high level. When you look below the European average, below the OECD average, there are others. Portugal, another story of success. Now, who would have thought that? Portugal, the kind of poor cousin of Europe, not a very well economically developed system, but it moved the needle. Now, Italy as well. I think the last year, you can see again also there a trend downwards. But you can see actually these countries have got their act together. In South America, some countries with real success. In the Middle East, you can look at a country like Qatar that has moved the needle. And why do I highlight Qatar? Because it's the only country in the Middle East that has moved the needle. All the other countries have plenty of money, but not changed the needle. Money is always good to have, but is by far a guarantee for success. But the most troubling signal is this. When we actually looked at creativity among 10 and 15-year-olds, we see that in most education systems, 15-year-olds report lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you here, your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say, wow, this can't be. In school, there's always something that you learn. But maybe not. Maybe our school systems also take some things away from people. The good thing is that we're all born with an abundance of creativity. Creativity is something, curiosity, that is deeply, deeply human. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question anything you tell them. They're going to experiment with everything that you put into their hands. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when the context changes. And then we put them into school. We try to, make them compliant with our ways of thinking, our ways of walking, and we see this. And I think that's also something that we should, take to heart. Maybe our education systems are really built for a different time, and they take away some of the most important ingredients that we need for tomorrow. That's, on your conference agenda, that what question is so important. We spend a lot of time in education to talk about the how, the pedagogy, the mechanics, and all of that. We spend surprisingly little time on the purpose of education. And I mean, this is an illustration why we, need to change that. When you actually look at, why we educate, I think the first thing is pretty obvious. Education should help you find out why you are here on this planet. What is really important to you, where you can make a difference. Education should help you find out, where your talents are, where you can become really, really good at. And that is far from trivial. We try to address it in many European systems by giving young people more choices in what they study and so on. And that could be a good thing, but it is not addressing that question. It actually explains some of the social segregation that we see in Europe. Because young people make choices without getting people to help them, to coach them, to find out where their talents are. They choose easy subjects and they come from disadvantaged backgrounds. It is one of the things that explains the social disparities, not just money and finance and teachers and resources. So helping you find out what you're good at, but following your passion is not what makes you happy in life. What makes people happy, if you look at research, is typically the difference they make to other people's lives, in their communities, in helping young people find out, what the world expects from you, what the world needs from you. It's equally important. And again, we should ask ourselves to what extent are our schooling systems in Europe, helping young people to understand their place in society, how they can move and advance, their place in everybody else's. And last but not least, you talked already about the needs in Europe. How do you translate better skills into better jobs and better lives? We're not doing very well on this in Europe. Even countries that have highly skilled people often have those people leaving the country because they do not find the opportunities to transform their societies, their communities, their economies. It's a big. I was last week in Greece. They have a lot of educational efforts, many people, but most of the graduates don't find a place in their country. So when you look at how countries come out on this, take the front runner on the PISA assessment, Singapore. They get 10 out of 10 points on the PISA assessment. You think, and they keep improving on this. But when you scratch the surface and you look a little bit deeper, you find even a country like Singapore has a lot of homework to do. You can see Singaporean kids are not that happy. The orange bar is quite short. They show remarkably little emotional resilience. Can you reinvent yourself in tomorrow's world? When the world changes. Can you address difficulties and live through this? Very, very important kind of quality. Singaporean kids are not doing particularly well. The quality of social relationships. Can you live with yourself? Can you live with people who are different from you? Can you live with this planet? Those kind of things are not on the margin. They're very central for success. And you can see they haven't got the attention than like academic performance in a country like Singapore. So that's what we need to take a much broader view on what educational success really means. And you think, well, Singapore is far away from Europe. But if you take a European country, you take Ireland, another country that comes out well in academic performance. They get not 10, but 9 out of 10 points on academic performance. Reading, math, and science. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same picture than in Singapore. Irish kids are not very happy. Relatively low level of emotional resilience. So again, there's a lot of work that we have to do in Europe as well. Take another European country, Albania. Isn't it interesting? They get the top score on psychological well-being. They're all happy children. But they do very poorly academically. And now you ask yourself, maybe we have to make a choice. Either we, put a lot of pressure on kids, they do well academically like the Singaporeans, and then, they end up unhappy. Or we make children happy, and then, they lose out academically. But, you find countries like Denmark, and I think it's a really interesting case, a system that does pretty well on everything. Danish kids come out very well on the academic level. But what is interesting, they also come out really well on the social emotional outcomes, because they teach academic outcomes not at the expense of social emotional skills, but through social emotional skills. And that's very, very much about what happens in Danish classrooms. Kids are happy, but also the green bar is interesting. Danish kids can take action, they can take responsibility, they can mobilize their cognitive social emotional resources, because that's what they do every day in the classroom. They're not passive consumers of prefabricated content. They're actually part of the instructional environment. Danish kids have a lot of influence of what they learn and how they learn. A lot of their learning is experiential, vocational education, big part of that. They show good level of emotional resilience, a high quality of social relationships. They're open to different ways of thinking, different ways of working. That has traditionally been Europe's strength. If you think there's one thing where Europe has really done well historically, it was actually the capacity to draw on, the talent from very different kind of origins. Europe was always most successful. If you look at the Great Renaissance every time, bringing together different cultures, different views, different perspectives, building something new out of that. And you can see in the case of Denmark, they're quite well developed among young people. They're interested in other ways of thinking, in other cultures. Unfortunately, that's not true in many European countries. It's no longer true. The kind of political polarization that we see, among adults is actually something that we see in many European classrooms as well. Because we've lost track of that. We've lost sight of that strength. So if you look, around education, one thing, we have already seen, global conflict is on the rise. And we see it when it touches us, In Europe, you look to the conflict in Ukraine, and I can say, one of our pilot schools, was destroyed on Saturday, just last Saturday. You can ask yourself, how can we actually destroy schools? It's so hard to build schools. It's so hard to bring teachers, but we can actually physically destroy schools. But, if you look on a global scale, there's a lot of conflict going on in many parts of the world, and it's rising. It's not just when it touches us personally. You look to Gaza, you look to, Sudan, South Sudan. There's so many places in this world that are deeply, and that is driving, migration. Whether it's labor migration or asylum, that, movement is also ending up on your doorsteps. This is something that teachers are confronting with. And when you actually do surveys of teachers, as we do at the OECD, you see the number one kind of thing that teachers feel unprepared for is actually this, teaching people from different cultures. Because, it's a new experience, a novel experience. And the challenge for educators has always been that you have to live the future today that you want to see in your students tomorrow. And society, unfortunately, isn't always you necessarily. Education is an incredibly conservative social enterprise. Parents, get very nervous when their kids no longer learn what was important to them, or when they start learning things they no longer understand. Now, as a teacher, you are more likely to teach how you were taught than how the world expects you to teach. And also at the policymaker levels, ministers can lose an election over education. When something small goes wrong, they rarely win an election over education. It's really, really hard. It's very, very difficult to do. So, and another response is the kind of trade barriers that we see. Now, we thought, globalization was forever, interconnectedness, but actually, we see that things are getting in the way of that. And this is not about, just trade rules. It's very much about mentalities of people. We are sort of seeing. And then, on the political front, well, it's very hard to measure democracy, but when you look at this in terms of voter turnout, it's going in the wrong direction in many European countries, but also other parts of the world. Political polarization, when you add, extreme left, extreme right parties, populist parties, you have about a third of the people in Europe now voting for those kinds of parties. They're no longer trying to sort of build common ground, what brings us together. They're looking, for pulling us apart. And young people, having different kind of perspectives of participating in the labor market. And teaching is a good example. In the past, we thought teaching is a lifetime job. And most people, get very worried when there's attrition, when people leave the profession. But, everywhere around us, this is the new normal. Young people aspire to different careers in their lives. They want to do different things. We need to think much more creatively about how do we bring people into education from different walks of life. And I think Teach for All is an amazing model for that. How do you get the best and brightest, whatever they have, studied, how do you actually create a social purpose for them, a social mission for them, bring them into something where they can shape our future? We need more of that. And at the same time, people will make later choices, different choices later in their lives. It's happening everywhere, even among older people and so on. On the climate front, I know these days there are many doubts about it, but people are voting with their feet. You can see that employment for the first time in the green energy sector is bigger than in the brown energy sector. Who would have thought so? That's the reality. It means that, young people want to deploy their skills in different contexts, and they can do so. And then last but not least, artificial intelligence. You can see rising number of people with talent in this area, rising demand on this. That's the bright side of digitalization, but there's also the troubling side, digital addiction. When you actually survey young people in Europe, you have about 40% of European 15-year-olds who say, I can no longer concentrate in my class because I'm distracted by my own smartphone or by my neighbor's smartphone. You can ban smartphone. That's one response that we see increasingly in Europe. And it has some positive effects, but it can't be the solution. Just shut down things. There need to be other things, but this is a reality. Digital addiction is really an issue. And we can see the negative relationship with academic outcomes is one thing. We also see a negative relationship with many social outcomes. Young people feeling more isolated, less connected, all of those things going together. And not surprisingly, that has brought mental health on the rise. It's now the number one social concerns in the countries for which we have data. Now, most other things that have troubled us have actually improved, or many of them have improved. So what does this mean for all of us? We need to see how we can, on the one hand, build greater sustainability into systems, helping young people keep the world in which we live in balance, in a better balance, and at the same time also live in a world that is structurally imbalanced. And that is, I think, the bigger part of the work. And again, I think an area where Teach for All is so incredibly important. This world, is increasingly volatile, increasingly complex. And as humans, we are born to value stability, predictability, because that has kept us alive for many times. But that is not the world in which we live in today. How can we address this? The first thing we all talk about is money. And you can see, yes, broadly, there's a positive relationship between, how much we spend and, the quality of learning outcomes. But you see many exceptions. I want to just show you one. You can look at Austria and Latvia. Austria spends way over twice as much per student than Latvia, even if you account for purchasing power parities in it. And you can get the same result. So money alone is not going to get you to a better education systems or more equitable education systems. Aligning resources with needs is important, but it is actually far from sufficient. Learning time. People say, okay, you want better outcomes, you need to give me more time as a teacher, as a school. And you can see there is huge variability in the learning time that students in Europe get. You can see in Italy, number one, very long school days and a lot of homework, a lot of tutoring. All of this is the green part. You look at Switzerland, very short school days, very little homework. But when you look at productivity, you can see that in Switzerland, students learn a lot in very little time. And in Italy, they spend a lot of time and learn comparatively little. So it's not about money, it's not about volume of time. It's really much about other things. So now you ask me, what are those other things that explain, success in Europe? And, one is very, very obvious, and that is the quality of student-teacher relationships. I personally believe that, AI is going to take over a lot of, the instructional part. Instructional delivery is going to be hard for teachers to compete with technology can do for us. It's going to make learning so much more engaging, so much more interesting, so much more personal. But, what matters in education has never been a transactional business. It is always a social, a relational experience. And you can see the number one predictor of, the independent learning of students. Now, that's here what we look at the left side. Now, the capacity of students to be motivated, to have that capacity to learn on their own, number one predictor is the quality of the social relationships, the support that students perceive, where students feel, I have a teacher who knows who I am. I have a teacher who cares who I want to become. I have a teacher who accompanies me on my personal journey. That alone, irrespective of what that teacher actually does in the classroom, is a very, very powerful predictor for your independence in learning, which is the key today. And by the way, also for your academic achievement. Also that is really, really important. So building that social capital, giving teachers more time for other things in teaching is, by the way, that's something that in Europe we can learn from countries in Asia. In Asia, as a teacher, you have a lot more time to spend with students outside the instructional setting. You have a lot more space and responsibility for your students outside the instructional setting. And that is what creates that glue that holds together classrooms and societies. Anxiety. Many people say, well, what makes students worried these days is, things like climate change or, academic pressure or tough examination. There's very little evidence for that, honestly. We do not see any relationship between, the toughness of the exam and student anxiety. The biggest relationship is teachers, where students feel intimidated by their teachers, and, it's not a negligible share. You can see anxiety goes up. Where students feel supported by their teachers, you can see anxiety goes down. However tough school is, however demanding school is, where students feel that support from their teachers. Here we ask one question, if you come back 3 years from now, and in your school, do you think your teachers will be excited to see you? And where students say, yes, I believe so, you can see they're not very worried. Where students say, no, I don't think my teacher cares, you can see anxiety is higher. So these things are very, very important. How do we create conditions for this? Now, again, the first thing when we talk about, teacher shortages, people say, we've got to pay better salaries. I think it's true in some European countries. I'm the first to support that, but not in all. I think in a country like Austria, Germany, it's very hard to make an argument for salaries. And in fact, when you look at this across countries, you look basically here on the vertical axis, the teacher salaries. On the horizontal axis, you look at, do I regret or appreciate the choice I made to become a teacher? You can see there's no relationship. You can see in Korea, teachers are paid very well, and they're very happy that they were teachers. That's great. You can see in the case of France, teachers are not very well paid, and they're very unhappy. That's also understandable. But you can see teachers in Portugal, or teachers in Finland are not particularly paid well, but they're very happy to be teachers because their work is intellectually attractive. Maybe not so financially attractive, but it's a great job, great career perspectives, great team in the school, all of that. But there are very, very few countries in Europe that have moved from the very industrial work organization of teachers to that more kind of professional work organization. And then there's Portugal. You can say Portuguese teachers are really well paid, comparatively, but they're very unhappy. So once again, money alone is not the answer. It comes down to something that I know Teach for All pays a lot of attention to, and that is, how do we bring teachers together? How do we build communities? How do we create opportunities for professional collaboration? Very, very important predictor for job satisfaction. Better predictor than the monetary conditions and so on. And very importantly, the more that collaboration, the more that professional development is collaborative, the more you see that self-efficacy that you want to see among teachers. Teachers who take ownership over their professional practice. You can see the more teachers teach as a team, the more they are engaged in collaborative professional learning, the more they observe each other's classrooms. All things that are not so common in Europe yet. They're starting to emerge. In some of the countries here, sort of this moving away from very vertical, hierarchical structures to more horizontal, lateral structures is starting to emerge. And I think, you are the best model for that. The Teach For organization in Europe are changing this culture. But you can see it has an effect. It has an incredible effect on the teacher's autonomy, on a teacher's self-efficacy, on teachers' job satisfaction. What are the biggest drivers of teacher stress? I know in Europe we have spent a lot of time to reduce the size of classes. People think that's making people stressed. We should have smaller classes. A lot of money has gone into this. Austria is again a good example here. But actually when we look at teacher stress, the number of hours they spend with students is not necessarily a big source of their stress. The stress comes more from, other things, in particularly administrative work, where people do things they do not perceive are part of their job, which is a social and relational job. And that's where, the anxiety, the stress comes from. That's where we need to work on again, and that brings me to the final point. It's about the social status of teachers. And again, it's not the kind of monetary environment. It is very much about the perception that teachers have. You can see in Europe, a country like Finland, a good majority of teachers feel society is with me. Every day I face really difficult challenges, but I can trust that my job will be valued by the society around me. You can look at the other end. You have Portugal, Sweden, France, Slovak Republic, where it's less than 1 in 10 teachers who feel society is with them. We need to turn that around, and that is far more important, far more influential than, talking about the size of classes and all of this. How do we build that social capital? And the only way you can build is by opening up possibilities. The more teachers, relate to each other, the more they relate to parents, the more they have an active role in society, the more they feel, appreciated by society. It's really about building professional agency. That, making teachers the game changers, the kind of, and, that has to do with the teachers, it has to do with the school leaders. The leadership that you see in school, the leadership in the system is, and again, and that is your agenda. It's such an incredible predictor for, the role and responsibility that teachers have. It's to do with the individual resources that we create in education, but it's even more to do with the collective resources that we create in education. To what extent, are teachers users of instructional material or resources that come to them, or designers? As a teacher, are you just an instructor, or are you a great coach, a great mentor, a great facilitator, a great social worker, a creative designer of, the instructional system around us that has a huge influence? And of course, at the end, it's about the system that we build around us. And I really believe the work that you do here at Teach For All is such an incredibly important part of that overall system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for what you just have shared. Of course, the plan was a little bit different. We have more time for questions, but we have some, so don't worry for those that want to ask. I have one particular reflection of what you just said, which is that we often seek for technical solutions for problems that are not technical, and what type of leadership we need for that type of challenges that are more adaptive, that requires collaboration. So I'm staying with that, but we want to give space to you. Do you have any question or a reflection that you would like to share after what you just experienced? Because it's not about just hearing, but experiencing what Andreas has shared with us.
Hello, I'm Mona from Estonia, and I have a question. A big part is also the parents of the children. For example, we are dealing with how to implement social skills into our schools in Estonia, and we see that parents are still very much into academical knowledge. And do you have any data, or do you see anything in the future happening that the parents would be on board as well?
It's an interesting question, but, parents listen to the signals that the education system gives to them. If the education system talks to parent only through academic achievement, exam scores, and, classroom work, then that's what parents will look at. If the education system takes a broader perspective, parents will take a broader perspective. So I don't think the problem is with parents. Parents are a reflection of that system. The question is really, can we develop better signals? Some of that is not so difficult. When you ask employers, for example, employers would say, yeah, I want someone who's great in math and science, but I want even more, someone who can work with other people, who can work autonomously, who can, be imaginative, creative. But that voice often gets lost in the formal design of systems. So I think, we should rethink the way we build our exam systems, our credentials, and then I think parents will make different judgments. So I don't think that's the problem. It is more kind of the response to the system.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Just a short question. My name is Alexander, and I'm from Teach for Armenia. What's the correlation between the happiness and the academic achievements? We locally implement a model called Serund, where we engage lots of social-emotional learning tools. And we've noticed a huge difference when it comes to academic achievements in the positive sense of the sentence. I wonder if there are any measurements or if you have any interesting data on that. And then the second question is whether you're going to share this presentation with us. I'm sure everyone wanted to ask that question, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You can have the presentation. On the first question, unfortunately, very few European countries take part in our assessments on social emotional learning, but we do have those kinds of data. And actually, I would say, people would have said traditionally, well, you can't measure things like empathy or curiosity. You can, actually. We have developed metrics that are actually pretty robust, pretty reliable, and they tell you that story. That actually academic success and social emotional development are very highly correlated. And the question is how you develop academic success through social emotional support rather than at the expense of it. We all know, every psychologist will tell you, kids do not work very well or learn very well when they do not feel that support. You can see that in the data here. I think the more we can build strong relationships. It's, by the way, one of the reasons why we see that interesting relationship between the size of a school and outcomes, both cognitive and social emotional outcomes. When schools get very large, it's very, very difficult to build those intimate social relationships. The smaller schools have a real advantage, up to 400 kids in a primary school. Yeah, so there is data on that. We can actually do this, and I think the question is more how do we build stronger systems around it. One of the problems that we have in Europe is that we mix up students all the time. You teach one subject rather than a student. And that has some advantages. It's often done on equity-related grounds, but it doesn't allow for building that strong relationship that you also want to see. Now that's I think our systems are often not geared to this. In Europe, we have highly stratified systems. Now they make you go for different programs, different school types. I do not know about Armenia, but in many countries in Europe, that is a big part of the problem, that students are actually rooted into different system parts and therefore divided. You no longer see that whole spectrum of students in front of you. So I think the more we can actually build, the social fabric, the social capital in the schools and around, and by the way, also with society and parents, I think the more we will, social emotional skills are, the school can play a supportive role, but a lot of it happens outside, the classroom. And I think as a school, taking activity on this, but, if you're interested in Armenia, I really believe the assessments that we do in this field are really very, very, and wherever countries or sometimes cities do those assessments, they really find them inspiring because they see things that they haven't seen before.
Hello, my name is Arnold. I'm from Slovakia. I just wanted to ask a very temporary question. So how do you think, or what is your take on how the data that the OECD is gathering going to help us with the deal with the changes that AI is bringing to the educational landscape? So what are some early indicators that you're looking at? How does OECD see the coming change?
It's a very, very good question, but one is difficult to answer. At the moment, if we're honest, we see more of the negative effects than the positive effects. The decline in reading skills is a good example. That is clearly, the fact that AI makes your view of the world more myopic. It connects you with people who think like you, who look like you, who walk like you. It makes you read things that clearly has a negative effect on your reading skills. Reading is about, building a complex mental representation about the world. Reading is about, seeing problems from different angles, perspectives, and that atrophies in that. And that's what we see in the data. So in the moment you can say, well, AI is not that great on education. The positive effects are too isolated. Most of the education systems in Europe have not been very good to leveraging AI in a positive way. In fact, even I would say for teachers, AI could be incredibly empowering for teachers. You could see how your students learn differently. You could get, better data, better insights, and the analytics are incredibly powerful. But, often we see AI disempowering educators and school leaders. You become the slave of some scripted lesson plans and so on. So I think, I'm still very hopeful. I don't want to sound pessimistic. I personally believe that, the positive impact that AI could have, for example, on equity. I do not believe we will address the question of equity without AI. It's the only way how we can actually, personalize learning to the extent that it will actually leverage all students' talent. But, I think that positive side is underdeveloped. The negative effects are currently dominating the results that we measure. And I think that's the troubling picture that we see. But I think we need to look beyond that. And actually, I think in organization like Teach for All, that has people who want to see change, who are the change makers, would be a great, force for good in that discussion.
Maybe if I can follow up on that, Andreas. I read a report from the World Economic Forum that says that AI might allow to free up to 40% of the teacher's time that right now is focused on doing other things rather than spending time with their students, to actually spend more time with their students. Considering the connection that you put between quality time, teacher-student time, and overall outcomes, are you a believer that actually AI can help us raise that time, the quality time that is so much needed in the relationship between teacher and student? What do you see?
I clearly see that potential, and I'm very, very confident that actually, we can get rid of so much boring, uninteresting, irrelevant work as educators, as school leaders, through AI. But again, also we should be, to some extent, cautious about that too. Today, you get, as a parent, you get 20, 30 emails from your teacher, and maybe some of them AI generated, and you do no longer have that 5 minutes of time that actually makes a difference. Now we are getting inundated with information, and we're actually losing that, personal social relationships. I hope that this will not be the consequence. I do hope that 40% actually ends up in, the coaching, the mentoring, the building of social capital, the work with parents, and not, sending more emails or creating more templates. And so far, I'm not so convinced, but I do think in the future, I think we will see that.
I'm Frances from Teach First in the UK. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I was just wanting to ask about your comment about teachers being valued by society and the concept of that, and whether you've seen that be successful in any countries, and if so, how? Because we're struggling a lot with retention and recruitment of teachers, and whether it works from government level or at school level, how it works and if it has been successful.
It's a difficult question. There are huge differences across European countries. That's very clear. But actually remarkably little change on that. The countries that have a high status of the teaching profession keep it high, sometimes slight decline. We have seen very few countries that have improved the status of the teaching profession. And Britain is a good example. And if you ask yourself, I still remember the time, when Britain introduced an army of teaching assistants. Now we say, okay, it's too tough for you to deal with all the social problems. We give you someone to help. But, has this improved the status of the teaching profession, or actually made it more myopic, more narrowly focused on student learning, giving teachers, taking away the tools from teachers to actually see the students who not to fall into the norms, see the students that need the extra support. And so I think I would say Britain is a good example where, the increasing tailorization of work organization. You have more and more specialists working and so on, and teaching being narrowed could be actually, one of the reasons why it the increase in resources that has been spent in education hasn't translated into change in behavior, change in perception, because society will always value people they care about. If you as a parent hear from the teacher and you know the teacher and you feel that teacher cares for your child, you'll be positive about this. If you feel this is a big machine, a big black box, probably you think, well, anybody could do that kind of job. So I think work organization, unless the whole work organization changes very hard. You do not move the needle with advertising campaigns. Lots of countries are trying to do that at the moment. It makes a blip. You get a few more people into teacher universities. You lose them very quickly when they've entered the profession. So I think the leadership you have in the school, in the system, the kind of work organization, without tackling that, it's very, very hard to change the kind of pattern.
Thank you for your presentation. I have more like a future perspective questions, because we see in Northern Europe we have one sort of problems, and Southern we have different problems, and we are all interconnected, and this is more like a perspective speculation for the future. Are we looking that for the security of Europe in general, for education, strong teachers, strong children, so on, that we're looking more in the United States of Europe now, because we're so connected? If Southern European part is in danger, then it also affects the North and the East and the West, and all connected. Do you have some sort of like perspective where we look in this? Because publicly what we see, it goes abroad now from my country to different countries. I hope you understand my question, so thank you very much.
To be honest, I think there's surprisingly little effort in Europe on that. It starts with, curriculum design, curriculum development. European countries still see education as a domestic field of policy. There's very little collaboration on the what, Europe could be so much stronger if countries would think together about, who do we want to be as European citizens? How do we create that global mindedness among young people? That space is shrinking. We're doing a little bit more in mathematics these days, but we're actually giving away some of the space that brings countries together on the what question. On the how question, Europe has tried lots of things. Teacher mobility, it's actually quite easy, quite well supported to go abroad, but in practice, those things often do not work really well. When you come back, your school principal, but you have been on holiday, it's not really part of. So I think there's a lot more that Europe could be doing to create a common space for education on the design of it, because I agree with you. That is where we need to see that continent.
One last question out there.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, very insightful. I learned a lot of things, but one thing especially really was peculiar, in my opinion. So Denmark, we have to pay a visit, I believe, in their schools, right? And learn a couple of things, a beautiful balance. But what I was wondering about the case Denmark is they really got the point, apparently very qualitative relationship and high-skilled teachers. What I was wondering about is there was a shift in the policy that boosted this quality relationship aspect, or is it something more organic coming in the society or out of the society itself?
It's a good point. I don't have a clear answer to this, but education in Denmark has become quite localized, but still very strongly connected. You could say when you look at this mechanically, United States, Denmark have a very similar organization. Education is a responsibility of local communities. But what makes Denmark so different is that all of those communities work together very, very closely. So at the same time, at the one end, they focus very much on the local relationships in the school. School is not an academic institution, but it's really part of the local infrastructure. Schools are very good in connecting with employers, with parts, and that's how they create these authentic learning environments. But at the same time, there's an amazing culture of collaboration. I was actually, a few weeks ago, I was in a room with 1,000 local school leaders. Now, they actually meet physically. They come together because they know there is no substitute. There's no network that can do that. And they share their experiences, and they have very good mechanisms of building, that, strong system overall, while keeping a very, very strong sense of local commitment. And there's very little bureaucracy in the system. The minister who was at that very same meeting can't tell any school, any teacher much. It's their business to create their kind of environments. They have that responsibility, but at the same time, they have that collaborative culture. Now that's, I think, and that's something that many education systems have done the first part in Europe. There is a tendency to talk about greater school autonomy and all of those things. Now, that you see in many European countries now. But that second part, to build that collaborative culture within the schools, within the community, across the system, I think is something really worth to learn from Denmark.
One last reflection. This couldn't have been the best, there couldn't be a better way to start our conference. So we wanted to ask you one last reflection around our work.
When I'm thinking about collective leadership and collaboration and togetherness, it comes down very often to very simple but the hardest things, which is trust. When I reflect on my country, word collective in our native language has such a strong historical connections that it's very negative, it's very heavy. So sometimes we cannot even use it. So I'm thinking about how important this thing that we have going on in the Teach for All network it is, especially in Europe, that finding our ways to think about collectiveness as something that can be new, not something that history make us think about in a negative way. And I wanted to ask about collective leadership, Andreas, but I think it would be too maybe obvious. I have one question that I want to model based on what you said at the beginning of your presentation around purpose of education. And you said that the one thing that education is supposed to do with two children is ask them fundamental question. Why are you here on the planet? And I think the safest place in the world is the Teach for All room. And this is a question that I would like to ask to you, if you might. Why you are here, and what, as Andreas, why you are here on the planet in the context of OECD work. And if you think that OECD role in everything that is going on and we discussed will be evolving to serve everything that we've discussed and you shared, if you feel like answering and feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, first of all, I think this question on trust, I think, is really, really important. Trust is something you cannot mandate, you cannot legislate. It's always the fruit of healthy relationships in the system. And that is why it is so hard to build and so easy to destroy. And I think it's a very, very good point. On myself, I joined the OECD when there was no department for education. We talked about human capital as part of employment policies. So it was, we looked at the results of education and the impact it has on, economic, social development. But, I ask myself, if we do not change the foundations of that, we will not see differences in the results. So I really created that, branch of education in an economic organization. I ask myself, where can you make a real difference in the world? If you go for another education, part, you speak with the converted. And I thought, we working in an economic organization, thinking about who do we want to be as a society, and building the foundations for that. That was really my motivation, and that's where I wanted to make a difference. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes not.
As we all do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.